Welcome all of you to this Ventures course. This is, again, a new platform for most of us doing Ventures. We're trying this Zoom and seeing how it's working. I will note that this meeting is being recorded. And so we ask that you be aware of that as you do sharing, but as we go into small breakouts, that breakout time will not be recorded by us, so that you can feel free to be as revealing or not, depending on what your comfort level is. We record these sessions because we build a library of continuing education for both laypersons as well as pastors. And people have so much appreciated being able to go back and view the sessions again. And I'll be sending out the link to you all after the session is over, so that you can also review it before the next course session if you want to. And if you realize that you have friends that really should have been here tonight and didn't make it, they can still register for the next session of the course and even view this first session before that time. And so if we have twice this many people for the second session of the course, we're not going to complain. So we are delighted to have you all here. And I see there are people that are still logging in. Glad that you're making it. This is great. But without further ado, I am so pleased to have Katy Gray-Brown and Virginia Rendler from Manchester College with us. And usually, as you know, I take time to introduce them and explain to you why they're so important that we should listen to them. But rather than taking the time for that, I simply want to hand it over and let them share what they feel comfortable sharing of themselves. Manchester University, I sit corrected. I'm so used to having been Manchester College for so long. So Manchester University, we are delighted. Your reputations precede you for most of us, but there's some people that may not know you as well. So we'll turn things over to you. They have invited me to let you know that you are more than invited to use the chat feature of this extensively. If you have questions while they're presenting, feel free to send a chat, throw it in there. Even if they don't take time to answer it, then we'll circle back and make sure we get to the questions or comments that you raise. And when we come to times like these where we're in gallery view, and by the way, for those of you who are not as familiar with Zoom, if you're only seeing my picture big in the middle and not as many other people's pictures, or just a small strip across the top, you may want to switch to the gallery view. If you're on a computer, there's a button up in the upper right-hand corner that says view, and you can choose gallery. If you're on a mobile device, if you swipe left or right, you can change your view and see more faces. That may help you be able to see more of us at the same time and participate better. But while we're having just open discussions, sort of like now, if you want to participate, we found it less intrusive to use the raise the hand function within Zoom, and better if you just raise your hand like this, and we'll be able to call on you and sort of know who can go next. And we'll give that a try. If we're missing you, feel free to raise your hand. That'll jump you to the top of the screen, and you'll get all of our attention that way. But we hope that our sharing tonight is able to basically go freely, because I know that Katy and Virginia really want this to be an interactive course. Are there any questions before I turn it over to our presenters to just take us away? Okay, so I'm going to mute my mic and invite you all, if you're not speaking at the time, to also mute your mics. It's just easier, because if there's background sounds, there won't be any interference into the meeting. And if someone's mic accidentally opens, I will probably sneak over and mute it for you, but please don't be offended if I do that. Feel free to unmute when it's time for you to talk as well. But if you get the little information saying host has muted you, it's just because there may have been something in the background that I was trying to make sure was muted. So Katy and Virginia, we're delighted to have you here, and take it away.
Thank you, Anton. And it's probably safer to let people introduce themselves. It's kind of a way to, it's not quite a whole disclaimer, but it allows us to sort of frame what brings us here. And I appreciate that. Virginia and I are happy to do that. And I'm so pleased to see some old friends and to meet new friends through ventures. This is a pretty remarkable technology. It feels like the pandemic has given the rest of us a reason to catch up with the technology that ventures in a way pioneered for bringing people together and really sharing resources across time and space in a way that's important for a community like ours. My name is Katy Graybrown, and I am professor of philosophy and peace studies at Manchester University, and I direct the peace studies program at Manchester.
Hi, everyone. Again, thank you for being here. I'm really excited that you all are interested enough in what we have to talk about to come out and be on your computers for a couple hours this evening. I really appreciate that. Looking forward to getting to know all of you better. My name is Virginia Rendler. I serve as the Peace Studies Coordinator at Manchester University. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that entails later on, but I'm a graduate of the program. I graduated from Manchester with a degree in Peace Studies in 2020, also a degree in philosophy and a minor in religious studies. So that's kind of my academic background. I've worked for the program for almost 2 years now, kind of coordinating, programming, and working with students. I'm really excited to be here with you all talking about something that was so important to me in my undergraduate career and is my chosen field. And I hope that you feel welcome to put any thoughts or comments or questions in the chat at any time. Did we have like an introduction question we wanted to do to get folks maybe used to using the chat a little bit? I would love to hear maybe if you just want to like throw your name and in the chat and what you're looking to learn here today or what brought you to this course. Katy, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So if there's something that it is on your mind bringing to this discussion tonight, I imagine that a lot of us are thinking about particular things, but we'd like to hear from you in the chat, your name, maybe where you are physically, and what's something that compelled you to sign up for this course in particular. Now, for those of you who are on a device that doesn't allow for chat very easily, this might be a raise hand moment and we can hear from a few people out loud.
Linda Williams in San Diego, thank you. Let peace prevail in Ukraine. And how, at this stage of the game, non-violently. Thank you so much.
Looks like we have some folks in chat that are introducing themselves. Hi, Monica and Roger. Some friends from Kansas. Lincoln, Nebraska.
What a day to be discussing peace. And before we gathered, Anton and I were talking about this, about balancing the materials that we have planned for today with this obviously pressing crisis that we're concerned about now in Ukraine. And so we want to make sure that there is time to discuss what's going on. And Linda, as you've lifted up and as we've seen in the chat too, what kinds of analyses would a peace studies perspective bring to this situation? And in the field of peace studies and from the field of theoretical and practical nonviolence, what is the world to do when we have a situation such as a military invasion of another country? Wonderful. Looks like a lot of us are able to chat. That's great. Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to meet you all. And Enton, Virginia, and I will be taking turns to keep an eye on the chat. So if there are questions or if a point isn't clear, you can ask for us to repeat something, to slow down and review something, to offer a further example, if that will help make things clear. All of that can go into the chat, and the three of us will keep an eye on that for your questions. And again, if it's easier to just flag us down, then by all means do that. And the beauty of having three folks with eyes on the screen is that we'll be able to keep track of this questions. All right. Well, Virginia, shall I start off with sharing my screen then?
I think it's that time.
It's this time.
Thanks to everyone who's still introducing themselves in chat. It's so fun to see folks from all across the country gathered to talk about this. It's really feels good.
Okay. I think we're loading now.
Yes, and unfortunately, I'm not seeing your camera appear on the slide. But we can still see you on the screen anyway. So,
well, and it just worked, didn't it?
it did before, and so it's puzzling that it's not now. But as I said before, it's not a deal breaker, so we can try it and continue. But if we're doing the same thing and it's not working, then Zoom is just being obstinate today.
Might well be. All right. Well, we'll work with this now. Maybe at some point I will magically appear in the lower right-hand corner. Do not be shocked when that happens. We'll try to make this as dynamic as possible, even without me there. This is a mural, and Julia Largent mentioned this in the chat. She recognized this mural. This mural was designed by Kay Geyer and painted by Peace Studies students on the wall of the administration building at then Manchester College and now Manchester University. But Virginia and I were thinking about ways to introduce concepts of peace and nonviolence that we study in our program, and to give you a background of the motivations and the structure of our program and the tools that we provide in the field of peace studies to really understand and critique violence in all of its manifestations. And to do that, we really wanted to give you first a history of the program. And we feel that's important for this gathering for a couple reasons. First of all, this is a program affiliated with the Church of the Brethren, and peace studies, as we will learn, is a field that developed within a context that is inseparable from the Church of the Brethren, both practically and philosophically and spiritually. I begin with this picture of Otho Winger, in part because I wanted to begin with an acknowledgement of where Manchester is, and the history of the land and how that's associated with the institution today. North Manchester, and I know that there are other Northern Indiana folk here. North Manchester is in the traditional lands of the Potawatomi and the Miami peoples. And we're at a particular spot where hunting grounds and settlement grounds for the Potawatomi and hunting grounds for the Miami converged. And so this was a place that even historically was a gathering place, a transitional place, a place of agreement and shared use of resources from Miami and Potawatomi peoples. After dislocation of Miami and Potawatomi peoples, contemporary Miami and Potawatomi folks have headquarters and federally recognized lands far away from the banks of the Kenopokomoko River, where Manchester sits. The federally recognized headquarters of those tribal communities are in Oklahoma, in Kansas, and Wisconsin. There are tribal headquarters for the Miami Nation of Indiana, down the way in Peru, Indiana. But Otho Winger, who was president of Manchester from 1911 to 1941, is significant in the context of this land acknowledgement because he had a close relationship with Miami peoples in Indiana. He was an instructor at the Miami Indian School in Wabash County and Grant County before he became president at Manchester. And after coming to Manchester, he felt an obligation, a commitment to continuing this relationship with the tribal communities of Indiana, and encouraged Miami students to come to Manchester even in the early decades of the 1900s. I've worked with the Miami community here in Indiana, and they still have stories of Otho Winger and the relationship that he extended to tribal peoples from Manchester College. And it speaks to Otho Winger's character. He was a vibrant personality, and he connected not only with the tribal communities, but he went on the church speaking circuit and extended connections between Manchester College and congregations throughout the region. And this was particularly important because historically there were some suspicions, there's some skepticism among the Church of the Brethren that higher education might take one away from faith with God. And so the institution of church-related colleges became significant as a way to encourage Brethren families to pursue higher education in the context that would encourage faith, that would affirm people living lives that reflected their religious beliefs. And Otho Winger was a dedicated witness to this idea that higher education could not be something that undermines our faith commitment, but reflects then our capacities to witness in the world. One of the points that Otho Winger took note of was a 1937 report from the Board of Christian Education to the annual conference. Now, the Board of Christian Education was an agency within the Church of the Brethren, and so this is a footnote in the minutes of that year. But the Board of Christian Education recommended that each of the Brethren colleges take on and emphasize some aspect of Christian living, whether that be frugality, whether that be peacemaking, not peacemaking, but home economics, and running a home wisely, and fostering good relationships in the home. And the one word that was ascribed to Manchester in terms of pursuing an aspect of Christian witness was peace. Okay? And so Otho Winger recognized that this was a message given from the agency to the denomination, a charge for Manchester to think in particular about how the institutional resources that were gathered here at the college could further the development of peace in our witness to the world. So enter in Vernon Schwalm, who came to Manchester in what is, I think, going to be a pattern here of Manchester University pilfering people from other brethren institutions. Vernon Schwalm was president at McPherson. He had been, I think, at Manchester. He was a history professor and then a dean until 1927. And then from 1927 to 1941, he went to the, I almost said Brother Heartland. My family are McPherson people. He went to McPherson and was president there until 1941, when he was lured back to Northern Indiana to become president of Manchester College. And Schwalm also took this directive from the denomination quite seriously and started exploring with other faculty at Manchester what it would look like to make an explicit sort of connection between the things that were happening at Manchester and this understanding of the Church of the Brethren's emphasis on peace. And this was obviously in this decade. I mean, what's happening at this time in the world when Vernon Schwalm is at Manchester? Looking for the chat or someone to call it out. He comes in 1941 for fall semester. Yes, Barbara. Schwalm said he was never a president during normal times. He arrived at Manchester, and soon after, the United States was drawn into this global conflict of World War II. Student population plummeted, right? By 1944, there were only 410 students at Manchester, 315 women and 95 men, because so many men had been drawn into either military service or alternative service of some sort during the war. Faculty numbers were reduced, and Schwalm felt just the weight of being a Brethren institution during this time of intense direct violence and organized war. Manchester University served as a civilian public service training camp for that time. He felt like that was an important use of institutional resources. And again, then after the war, there was this restructuring as all of these men returned with some financial support to go to college to pursue higher education through the GI Bill. Student enrollments expanded, and Schwalm built back the faculty and the student body in a way that was very intentional in terms of strengthening the liberal arts perspective. So rather than take the university in sort of specific professional directions, he said, we need to have a broad education in order to equip people to be good citizens and to be good Christians in this Brethren context. So on this question of mission, then, he finds, I would say an ally. He finds an active irritant in a 1917 graduate of Manchester, who's similarly committed and similarly poised to articulate the mission of the denomination in Dan West. And Dan West was more than happy to bend Vernon Schwalm's ear about what Manchester should be doing in this post-war context for preparing people to make a difference in the world, and for using institutional resources in a way that contributes to a peace witness in the world. By this point, he had, of course, started Heifer Project, was very busy in the work of sustainable development, also busy in talking with young people about the groundwork that would become BVS. But in the middle of all that, in the spring of 1947, Dan West, I wouldn't say volunteered, he informed Vernon Schwalm that he would be giving a seminar at Manchester on peace, right? And it was called The Bases for Enduring Peace. I love this picture of Dan West surrounded by students behind the ad building. And you see, there's one person with the hand up over there, right? These were packed. I think there were, 40 students that would gather around to meet with Dan West when he came down once a week to do this. And Schwalm was delighted. Earl Garver, all the faculty and administrators at Manchester were impressed by the energy and enthusiasm that Dan West brought. And they asked if he would continue, and West said, no, this is something Manchester needs to do in a way that's sustainable. It's not something that he could do. He had other projects in mind. And he said that the administration of Manchester had to find a way to continue this conversation on what a peace studies curriculum might be. So Vernon Schwalm was looking around. He pulled together a team of faculty for that fall of 1947, but he had his eye on someone else at another Brethren college, Gladys Muir. And Gladys Muir, she's Kansas Brethren. Her father was a professor at McPherson, so there's another McPherson tie. But she herself was teaching in Southern California at Laverne, in history and international relations. You see her in the middle here. She's tiny. But she had heard about Dan West's seminar, and she wrote to West to talk with him about what he was including and what he had in mind. Now remember, this is 1947 in the aftermath of World War II. When so many parts of the world, we were looking around to try to gather the pieces up and really reflect upon the failures that had led us to the destruction in World War II, and also the growing fear of living in the atomic age, of the capacities now that war, the destructive capacities that war represented. Muir had a summer fellowship to do some writing at Pendle Hill, a Quaker site, and she wrote to West, learned about his peace studies course, and Muir wrote a paper called The Place of the Brethren Colleges in Preparing Men and Women for Peace Leadership. Isn't that beautiful? It's not a long paper. It's maybe 8 or 9 pages. But she brings her understanding of history, and not just sort of global history, but also church history, in developing a vision for the special contribution that the Church of the Brethren has. And in that paper, she remarks that in the 20th century, we have seen all of these places of progress and development. And the strides have been enormous. However, they haven't been accompanied, all of those technological innovations haven't been accompanied by a parallel, a corresponding moral evolution. Right? And what she saw as the potential, as really the purpose of Church of the Brethren institutions of higher education, is nurturing the moral development that would harness in those technological innovations to do good in the world, to be a witness for peace and sustainability and well-being in the world, rather than destruction and violence. Right. It's a beautiful paper. It's available online. I'd be happy to send you a copy of it. Vernon Schwalm reads this paper and he says, leave Southern California, come to Northern Indiana, and I'll give you everything you need to start a peace studies program that's devoted to this vision of peace leadership. And Laverne didn't want to let her go. They wouldn't let her out of her contract that first year. So she had to wait until 1948. The president of Laverne said, if you still want to go in a year, you can. And she did. So she moved to Manchester in 1948 to develop the first undergraduate peace studies curriculum in the world, anywhere. So here's a question for the chat. What do you imagine in 1948 Gladys Muir said should be in the peace studies curriculum? What kind of courses? What kind of disciplines? What do you think would be there? Gandhi, and then, yeah. World history, nonviolence, conflict transformation, Jesus teaching and compassionate religion, biblical studies. These are great. You know, it's like you all wrote the curriculum. Really. A class on war and brethren positions of war. You know, this was dangerous of me. I should have asked, is anyone here a former student of Gladys Muir? Because they're still around. Hey, oh, well, but yes, I should have known, Barbara, right? So some of you have inside knowledge on what she required. How to react to those who stand in opposition to peace. Excellent, yeah. Well, this is good. So you have ideas, but you know what's missing from the list that you gave? Physical education. Let me show you what Gladys Muir came up with. So this is the curriculum from 1948 to 1949, the first catalog year in which this appears. An entire year of communications, which is part of this listening skills, speaking in a way that invites people into dialogue, an entire year of history, an entire year of biology, she said. That should be the first study that we look at. Foreign language, and then physical education. She writes in her notes that there's a particular PE course on folk games from around the world. And she said, this will foster cultural understanding, right? So all the peace study students had to take the folk games class. In the second year, literature, art, psychology, an entire year of religion, geology and geography, basing upon the knowledge that people had gained in biology the first year. And then there was a readings course that came in on the third year after people had read more history, psychology, sociology, and ethics. Right? And her readings seminars were famous. When I bring out the syllabi that she used for these reading seminars, sometimes it was 300 pages a week that she was asking students to read of Tolstoy, of Gandhi, of the Bhagavad Gita, of all of these religious and philosophical texts that she thought would equip people for the kinds of conversations we needed to have about the the moral basis for peacemaking and nonviolence. Right. She saved philosophy, well, other than ethics in the third year, saved philosophy for the fourth year. Didn't want to scare people off too soon, right? But this was the basic outline for the first peace studies curriculum in the world. Now, the mission of Manchester and the mission of the Peace Studies program. So there have been some changes. I seldom ask my students to read 300 pages a week anymore. I'm nowhere near as demanding as Gladys Muir was. But we operate within the same mission now. And so Peace Studies is very much defined by these objectives. The university objectives of respecting the infinite worth of every individual, graduating persons of ability and conviction who draw upon their education and faith to lead principled, productive, and compassionate lives that improve the human condition, right? So there are objectives for educating people and equipping them well, but then also an objective, an explicit objective for what we will use that education to do in the world. Okay. That's also embedded in the Peace Studies program, in the mission that we have on the right. The Peace Studies program graduates persons with a critical understanding of the causes and consequences of violence and injustice, equipped with both theoretical and practical knowledge of nonviolent ways of resolving conflict and promoting justice. Peace Studies prepares our graduates to be capable, confident, and courageous in the world and the work of building a peaceful and just world. I also put in there another objective of the Peace Studies program is to graduate people who will become part of this cloud of witnesses, part of a community of peace builders that have come through the Peace Studies program. But I was told by the assessment committee that that was not a measurable objective and I had to take it out. So it's, don't tell anyone, but it's still there. Okay, so this is the curriculum today. These classes are sprinkled across the liberal arts general requirements for graduating from Manchester. But the classes on the left are among the classes that are required for the Peace Studies major. Just an introduction to peacemaking, mediating conflict, nonviolent social change, religions and war. A capstone classes in philosophy of civilization, and in which we look at the ways that societies develop over time and what mechanisms can we use to change societies and civilizations, and then a class in environmental philosophy. We also have courses that are not in, oh, there I am. We also have courses that are not required for the major, but are very popular in the major, such as the Concerning Poverty class. And then some of these classes, the Peacemaking and Practice Abroad and the Current Issues in Peace and Justice class, those classes are immersion and travel courses in which we get people out into the world in order to really examine and explore issues of injustice and nonviolent social change in sight, different places. So where has Manchester gone? Manchester is no longer, Peace Studies is no longer just a Manchester-based program. There are now more than 300 Peace Studies programs around the world. Some of them range from like a certificate program in mediation or conflict resolution to PhD programs in peace studies offered at universities like Notre Dame and Syracuse University or the Uppsala Institute, or at George Mason University, the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. So it's a full-blown field now. But for about 20 years, after Gladys Muir came to Manchester in 1948, this was the only place in the world where there was a program in peace studies. Right? So we really had all of this period, especially during the 50s, during the Cold War, during the 60s and the Civil Rights Movement, where this was the only place that this kind of program existed. And so through the 1970s, through the 1980s, when other places developed programs, they would often send someone to Manchester to learn about the structure of our program and the development of it. So Manchester had the purpose of spreading all of the seeds that have sometimes grown into the programs that you see here, and developed into what now is a recognized field internationally. However, even though it's now much, much bigger than our small program, or the vision that was first sort of planted in that 1937 paper at annual conference, there are still some pieces of it that are distinctively Brethren. And I heard this from a colleague from the Catholic social justice tradition who directed a program at Kent State for a long time. You know, he said, you know, that he doesn't believe that peace studies would have developed the way that it did if it were not for the Church of the Brethren, and if it were not for the Brethren colleges and the context that Manchester University provided for it. Because it is explicitly based upon values, and Virginia will talk about some of these assumptions that we think, and our colleagues in the field agree, mean that this field, as it has developed, is directly a result of the context of the denomination of the Church of the Brethren and the peace tradition that we have protected. So before we turn this over to Virginia for the next section of this, I could stop for questions. If you have a question about any of this, you could put it in the chat, or we'd be happy to take questions or comments if you'd like to unmute. It's a great story, isn't it? Especially the part where we take people from McPherson and Laverne. You'd heard pieces perhaps of this story before. What was new in this telling of the story?
I have a question, and that is about, was it Otho Winger and his relationship with the Indian schools? Because at that time, of course, we were trying to, you know, save the man and kill the, you know, what was his position in all of that? Because that would have been a tricky thing to navigate.
Right. Yeah, well, the school at which he taught was not a boarding school. So children were not taken from their homes, and it had the support of the local tribal community and the elders. So it's an excellent point and a critical difference. This was not a school that removed people from their families or sought to acculturate people. It was very much focused on literacy and basic education, and then identifying those people who might be able to go for higher education, for continued education purposes. And one of the reasons that Otho Winger thought that Manchester would be a good fit for Miami students who wanted to continue was that it was also close to these communities, so that people could maintain their ties to their home communities. And so that was something I was concerned about when I spoke to my friends in the Miami community in Indiana. But they said, no, Otho Winger we tell stories about Otho Winger and his connection to the tribe. And they were very happy when Manchester helped host one of their Miami language camps for young people during the summer. So we've tried to maintain some of those connections, and we hope to make them grow.
We've got some questions in chat, some about the size of the program. Carolyn is wondering how many graduates leave Manchester every year.
Peace studies.
Yeah.
Carolyn, can you send us some? We're a very small program. We have generally between, I would say, 9 and 19 people at Manchester who are pursuing the Peace Studies major. So it's very small. Almost all of our students pursuing the Peace Studies major take a double major. We design the program so that it can be a complementary field of study to, say, for example, Julia Largent, communication studies or sociology or psychology. I wasn't calling you out. I was just saying, I was using you as an example. Or for Virginia, philosophy, we have people who major in peace studies and in biochemistry to pursue medicine. So it's a really diverse group because the needs of peacemaking are really diverse. But we've never been a large program. We don't have the numbers that other programs might.
Can you make Gladys Muir's reading list available to this group?
Oh, I can. I would love to do that. And in fact, I have collected boxes of Gladys Muir's material, and my deep desire is to write a book about her and compile this information because she's such a compelling person. But I would be happy to make some of her reading course syllabi available to anyone here. I'll even grade your papers if you want to send them to me. Sounds like collegial sharing. Well, Anton, I invite you to our archives. Some of the correspondence between the presidents does not sound so collegial. Gladys Muir was a very popular professor at Laverne in history, and she had sort of infused all of these students with excitement about international studies, and then she left for Indiana. So there were some, I think, less than happy feelings about that. But she really couldn't pass up the opportunity to start a program like this. She was excited and she felt a sense of purpose, not just in terms of her own work, but a purpose for Manchester, and in so doing, a purpose for the denomination. She retired and went straight back to California, if that's a consolation. Nobody retires and stays in Indiana, do they? I guess some of us do.
Okay.
Yes, University of Colorado. It's now called Peace, Conflict, and Security. Yes.
All right. I'm going to attempt to share my screen at this point, and we'll see if I show up in the corner, you can keep answering questions. Oh, there's me.
Hey.
Okay. Hi again, everybody. I'm down here in the corner now. So thanks, Katie, for that kind of introduction. Now I feel like you all have a little bit of a better understanding of Manchester as an institution. And I'd love to talk to you all a little bit more about the content of the Peace Studies program. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly so we can get to our discussion and our break and everything. But please feel free to make notes or put your questions in the chat. I'm going to make myself a little bigger. Ooh, it's fun. Okay. Awesome. So I'll talk a little bit here about my experience as a Peace Study student. I'm going to get into some of kind of the theory that we go through in class, some of the core kind of curriculum that we want students to leave the program with. But first, I'd like to talk just briefly about kind of that combination of theoretical and practical knowledge that we emphasize in Peace Studies. I'll talk about the practical first before I get into that theory. As you can see here, there's a picture, a group photo of us. That's on an alumni trip that we took to Montgomery, Alabama. So Peace Studies as a program involves a lot of travel and a lot of off-campus experiential learning. So every year we'll take a group of students and alumni on some kind of learning tour in some area of the United States or abroad. Recently it's been a little bit closer to home. But we have gone to Montgomery, we've been to Memphis. We've had a lot of great experiences that really foster intergenerational learning. And some faculty and also folks in the local area will come and kind of provide some education in the field for us. We also do a lot of volunteering and service work in our own community in Wabash County. That provides us a little bit more of that experiential learning, taking what we can gain in the classroom and bringing it to the community. And we'll also have a lot of opportunities for training and conferences. That's another big part of the experiential travel that we have. We'll have interactions in kind of an academic space at conferences with folks who are also in the Peace Studies field, which really was helpful for me as a student to understand how this works kind of as a career path and not just as a field of study. And we also have opportunities for training. So we work with organizations that do interpersonal one-on-one mediation and provide mediation trainings for our students, as well as kind of larger training on tools that help with things like canvassing or with organizations that are both local and kind of farther afield. So that's some of our practical engagement out there in the real world outside of the classroom. Here's a little bit of our content. I don't know if you can tell, I really like being in the slide. It's actually a lot of fun for me. So frequently the question about Peace Studies is like, what is it? When I tell people that I majored in Peace Studies, it's kind of confusing. So at its very basis, and I have heard a lot of people kind of answer this question, and I've had to answer this question in my kind of comprehensive final exam. That Peace Studies is kind of a study of the way that people have responded to violence and have thought about solutions or alternative approaches to conflict. Frequently, when I hear experts kind of talking about what Peace Studies is, I'll hear this word transformation a lot, transforming conflict into peace and justice. There's some discussion in the chat going on about Christian peacemaker teams. CPT stands for Christian peacemaker teams, which we do talk about in Peace Studies and often have CPT alum or volunteers come chat with us as an option. They do kind of direct nonviolent resistance to conflict. We'll go into areas where there is conflict or that might need kind of a third-party mediator, and often be the person in between situations of direct violent conflict. And sometimes just providing a witness, sometimes providing safety and security in those moments. Maybe Katie can talk more about that, but we have certainly had alum that participate in Christian peacemaker teams. And that's a really good option for kind of nonviolent direct resistance. Community peacemaker teams. I didn't know that. Okay, fun. Love that. So anyway, peace studies, what it is. When I hear experts talking about peace studies, I'm hearing them use this word transforming conflict into peace. And I really like this because it acknowledges that violence is something that we reckon with in society right now. There is violence. We're not in the business of pretending it doesn't exist, but it recognizes that conflict or violence has this capacity to become something more productive, to become something more holistic and beneficial, and that we're kind of in the business of making that happen or understanding ways in which we can make that happen. Katy talked a little bit about peace studies having a bias, a kind of a normative bent to it. And I appreciate this reminder that many fields have a bias or a normative bent. For example, the education field, prioritizes literacy over illiteracy. They make a claim that having knowledge is better than not having knowledge. The medical field makes a claim that being healthy is better than being sick. We make a claim that nonviolence is better than violence. And I think that often comes off a little more positional than maybe some of these other assumptions, because it's tied to maybe a political position or a certain ideological stance. But it really isn't necessary to be a part of the peace studies field. Just the basic assumption that it's preferable to solve conflict, and that conflict isn't the problem, that violence is the problem. It's preferable to solve conflict through nonviolent means. And we're really upfront about that. And sometimes that can come from kind of a more moral space. We talk about this pragmatic versus principled pacifism or nonviolentism, that you can be a nonviolentist who believes in that because of a religious position, because you feel that nonviolence is morally right. Or you can come at it from more of a pragmatic standpoint that nonviolence is more effective than violence. And a lot of times, in many cases, I think it's a combination of those two positions that bring you to a place where you recognize that nonviolence is something that you want to advocate for. It also, I think, something that peace studies has really done for me has helped me to realize that these opportunities to do peace work, opportunities to engage in creating peace, happen all the time, happen every day. And I think we realize this clearly when we look at peace studies as it happens on a multitude of levels, and I'll get into this in a second, but we're working for peace on a personal level, one-on-one. We're working on peace even internally. We're also working on peace in our groups and kind of in our cultural groups or our ethnic groups or our friendships or families, working on peace in our towns, in our cities, in our states, in our countries, in the world. So we have all of these levels that we're working on, and that the calls to peace work and the calls to nonviolence happen kind of every day when we're interacting with people one-on-one, to all the way when we're creating policy or advocating for something at the United Nations. And the last point about peace studies that Katy definitely mentioned as well is that it's extremely interdisciplinary. So our program kind of works and brings in courses in many other fields, such as political science, sociology, social work. And like Katy said, we have so many students who double major, who will major in things that you might not think might be the most logical combination with peace studies, but actually make a lot of sense when you start considering this field as a framework or a lens that provides you the tools to be a peacemaker in your chosen field, even if that chosen field isn't quote unquote peacemaking itself, that happens. So I'm going to advance to my next slide. This, it's mirrored, I'm sorry, is kind of our wheel of peace building. And this is really helpful when chatting with students. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is really helpful when chatting with students about what they might want to do with their degree. So you can see we have it breaking up kind of into these these three areas: structural and institutional change, violence prevention, conflict response and transformation, and justice and healing. And those kind of correspond to some smaller groups that can be really helpful in looking at where you want to focus your peace work. It can feel like when you're getting into the field that it's massive, that there's nothing that peace studies doesn't touch or can't be a part of. That's one of my favorite things about it. But I think that this really helps students or anybody understand that there are a variety of career paths that really fit in pretty clearly with these concepts that peace studies teaches, and can help people kind of focus their interest. I think that when I came to college, I had a conception that most of what peace studies meant was kind of in this orange area here of violence prevention and conflict response, but that it's a lot broader than that. And not that these kind of categories don't inform and work off of each other. They definitely do. But I think this is a really helpful tool in kind of explaining what and how peace studies translates into the professional world, because sometimes that's something people want to know when you tell them what you're majoring in college or you're focusing on in your life. Ooh, okay, I'm moving over here. So here's some of that peace theory that I was talking about before. I'm going to take you through just kind of like some fun terms and concepts that we talk about in our introduction class, and then continue to build on throughout the curriculum. And I hopefully will be able to contextualize why these concepts might be good for you to know just in general. First of all, we're talking about definitions of peace, which I think can be different for a lot of people, but a standard working definition that we have is that peace is something that's built through right relationships and ethical, harmonious associations that range from personal to global. So we're talking about kind of the way that we interact with the world in a way that minimizes the harm done. And that's what we're striving to build. So there are a couple different understandings of this. And here's a little chart from Johan Galtung, who's a major player in the peace studies field. So we're looking at here the different types of peace that we have available in our toolbox. And I think that a lot of maybe the general conception, I'm a little out of touch with the general conception of peace and violence, but I think that there's this understanding of peace as this negative peace definition that we see here. So that means an absence of direct violence or fear of violence. So that's something that you might hear, America is in the longest peacetime that it's ever experienced. We're a country we're experiencing peace. We're not involved in any wars. We're at peace. But I think that a lot of us understand that when we get down to it in the lived experiences of people in America, that they're not necessarily always the most peaceful, and that the government still does inflict violence and oppression on folks. So this is where we get into this idea of positive peace, that peace is not something that happens to us, but it's an effort that we have to work for. It upholds values, attitudes, institution, and structures that promote justice and resist violence. So it's not just an absence of violence, but it's these ethical institutions and relationships with each other that we continue to strive for every day. And so you can see kind of in this chart that idea of negative peace leaves opportunity for peace through strength, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit later. But this idea that you can achieve peace through military power, or you can achieve peace through having the biggest gun in the room. And that in peace studies, we like to make the distinction that's not necessarily what peace is, that peace is optimistic, it's active, it's not passive, and that the means that we use to achieve that peace affect the way that kind of works in our society. So if we're getting to peace through violent means, that affects kind of the end result. Not only is it less effective in its kind of in the ways that it works, but then when we've achieved our goal, that peace is a little bit less meaningful, or that maybe there has been harm done in some way. in achieving those goals. So that's an important distinction that we make in peace studies. We've got multiple levels of peacemaking, as I discussed earlier. So I kind of tend to think of these as small, big, small, medium, and large, but you can use these fun, fancy terms if you'd like to. So the macro level, that's our biggest one. So we're looking at nation-state relations and global systems. So when we think of macro level peace building, we're thinking about ending wars. We're thinking about how we can achieve kind of conflicts that happen between countries or large international actors. The meso level is this middle level. That can be intrastate conflict, like civil war, things that happen between ethnic groups, things that happen between cultural groups. This one gets a little fuzzy for me because it does feel like it can be so much of a broad range. So you're looking at intrastate conflict, but you're also looking at conflict between, medium-sized groups like gang violence, for example. And then micro level, that's our smallest level, probably the easiest one for me to remember. And that's interpersonal or familial conflict. So when we're looking at one-on-one, things like mediation, and kind of, I don't know, what was it called? Like peer mediation that we had in middle school, that one-on-one kind of problem solving happens at the micro level. And these are all, oh my God, a chart. Okay. So there you can see them in kind of circles, that the macro encompasses the meso, which encompasses the micro. And we're looking at systems. So big, medium, and small systems. And that peace building occurs kind of at all of those levels. Oh my God, I have to keep moving myself around. But we also talk about intrapersonal peace, so peace that happens on the inside. And I saw that one of our participants today, at least, was looking to develop some tools for peace within the spirit. And that's something we focus on too, as like we recognize that as an important part of peacemaking, that being at peace in your mind and not inflicting violence on yourself is part of peace building. And we'll look at kind of these strategies that might involve this. I mean, we do yoga. Does that count? All kinds of different ways to develop our personal peace. And peace ecology as well, I think was important to throw in here, to recognize that there are interdependencies between kind of in peace work that affect all of these levels. So it's really hard to look at macro level violence without understanding kind of the ways that it trickles down into the meso and micro level. And the way that we approach peace building might need to take into consideration all of these levels. So that's a little bit of peace theory, and I really appreciate the conversation going on in the chat. Eric, I like what you said about negative and positive peace. And we'd like to give you an opportunity to discuss that more, I think, in a breakout room. So here's a little activity. And I think the way that we're going to do this is that right after your breakout room is when you'll be able to go for a break. We're about halfway through our session tonight. So here's this question. In your breakout room, all of these levels of peace building, the meso, macro, micro levels, are critical to peace studies. And we're wondering if there's a particular type or level that is of special concern to you, or kind of a certain like issue or area of peacemaking that you think is especially critical right now, or that's weighing heavy on your heart and mind, and kind of where you might categorize this in these new categories that we've shared with you. So Enton should throw us into breakout rooms, I think of 5 each. And then after you've discussed this question for a while, please feel free to just head right straight to your break. I'm looking for a time that we want people back by, to have had this little conversation and then come back and be ready to share with the group. Okay, how about we come back at 7:25? So have that conversation come back at the 25, wherever you are in the country. when the minutes are 25, have this conversation in your breakout rooms. Maybe have somebody who is recording thoughts or is ready to share with the group, because we'd love to hear what you talked about when you come back from this break. So we'll send you into your breakout rooms, and we'll see you all back here at the 25, ready to share about the level of peace building that's of the most concern to you.
Virginia, a quick question.
Yeah.
If we come back at the 25, how long do you want the discussion to take, and how long of a break?
Let's do like maybe 5-minute discussion, 10-minute break.
Okay. And I will automatically place you all into breakout rooms. There's a few that have 4 because of the numbers, but we'll try to get it all balanced. So
Awesome.
here we go.
Yay.
Well, we're almost at our time to begin again, just in another few moments. So everyone, welcome back. Glad that you're here for the second part of today's session. I shouldn't really say second part. We've got only about 35 minutes left, but Katy and Virginia, we are so glad to have you here, and I'm looking forward to what you want to say next.
Awesome. Thanks, Anton, for bringing us back together. I am curious to know what you talked about in your breakout rooms about these different levels of peace building. I would love for some of you to hop off mute and share with us in your real voices, but in chat is fine as well. There might be some weird talking over each other, which is totally fine. We're all friends here. So what did you all talk about?
I'll go. This is Sue. Our group, Eric was mentioning that all levels are important in your sort of triangle, but that he was thinking more of like concentric circles, which we all thought was neat, and to look where things overlap, and that maybe that's where we should begin, and that maybe interpersonal peace or peace with God would be in the middle. Several people said that they felt like the interpersonal piece dealing with relationships, whether that be in the community, just being able to have civil, respectful conversations, as we know is issues today, dysfunctional families, problems at churches, somebody was mentioning, and that we need to start there. And Monica was saying, like, to think of the large scale is just so hard sometimes, but then we have things like that happen today, and so how do we begin? And we talked about having intentional communities to begin that kind of work.
Thank you for sharing, Susan. What else?
Well, our group focused more on the interpersonal, with the strained relationships that have come more focused because of the pandemic within families, and how not being in touch maybe made things worse than when they are or together more. One person is on a district shalom team and has learned quite a bit about needing to speak up at times when things don't look right.
Thanks, Marie. Yes, we like your background very much. It's beautiful.
Well, the background is a picture from the church lobby a few years ago. It's all those thousands of cranes.
Nice.
Well, not 1,000.
Anything else? Anybody else want to just do a quick shout out report? I see Julia saying that the group was micro and meso based on daily interactions with folks. That it's interesting. I appreciate hearing that because it gives us some perspective on what you all are interested in, and thinking, you know, how we all might have come to this focused on the smaller level, but the events of the day and the affairs of the world have kind of wrenched us into that larger level, which can be a scary spot to be operating in sometimes. But I'm glad we're all doing it together. Should we talk a little bit about violence? I'm passing it over to Katie to share screen for a bit. You're on mute, Katie.
Me in the corner with a bunch of pictures of violence. So we have a program that's devoted to analyzing violence and developing nonviolent responses to it, right? The preference is always for nonviolence in peace studies. But what sorts of things then are we creating responses to? And so we wanted, I just gathered, I did a quick Google image search. What qualifies as violence? How do you understand a definition of violence, or what words come to mind when you hear violence? Okay, and you can put them in the chat. You can unmute and share. What would be included here? And people recognize, I mean, what's going on in these pictures. I mean, obviously here we've got a tank, we've got a military engagement here on the left. Susan says physical or emotional harm, dehumanization, causing pain, physical or emotional. Yeah, emotional pain. This on the lower left-hand side is picture that was associated with online bullying on social media, and the psychological damage that comes. Thanks, Carolyn, for reminding me to speak up. Death and destruction, acts intended to do harm. Yeah, I usually think of violence, physical violence, right? That direct violence that Virginia was talking about. But then clearly we have some pictures here of violence that is not, at least immediately, direct violence, the sort of intentional physical harm, but structural violence. And different ways that violence and injustice occur in society. This picture here, does anyone recognize the picture of the runners? This is Kathy Switzer, a woman who registered for the Boston Marathon as K Switzer back when women were not allowed to enter marathons. And so she was granted entry. She was given a number from her entry as K Switzer, but then when these are some of the organizers of the Boston Marathon saw that it was a woman participating, they attacked her to try to pull her off the marathon course. But what I see in a lot, so systems that oppress, inflicting trauma on another. When we think of violence in peace studies, we have to understand this really broad range of human activities, and that human activities is key, that have to do with the infliction of intentional harm, the intentional infliction of harm. Right? If something is an accident, we don't think of it as qualifying as a violent act. If something is inflicted by something that's not humans, right? Say a bear attack, we would say that that's unfortunate, but we wouldn't say that the bear was an agent of violence. There's a moral ascription of responsibility that accompanies this understanding of what violence is, and this understanding of the role of intention being key. Right? So I wanted to ask, I don't have a picture of it, but where you might think that the destruction of property comes with this notion of violence. I see in the chat, there's the destruction of democratic institutions, acts intended to harm, clashing, crunching, lack of understanding, harm done to someone, to some people. But where does the destruction of property come in this? Susan says it takes away economic abilities. What else? It can damage livelihood. Okay. Taking away, let's see, if we take away damaging a person's livelihood or taking away economic abilities, a boycott will do that too, won't it? A boycott is often seen as a staple of a nonviolent social movement. It's a tool that many nonviolent movements have had. Does an organized boycott count as violence in that respect? What do you think? Oh, Susan's saying it's trying to stop an injustice, though. All right. So there's something is drawing our attention to not only the act that we do, but also the intention that we have in performing the act. Violence is the outcome and not the intention. Interesting. It causes a greater impact than it originally planned. This is a question people, and it's an important point to think about and discuss. People in the field of peace studies have different ideas about the destruction of property and whether or not it constitutes violence. There are people in peace studies who say destruction of property can never, is incompatible with adherence to nonviolence. But then we have a long tradition of people, for example, I think earlier there was mention of Pax Christi, but of the plowshares movement, of people who would destroy, say, draft registration cards, or do damage to missile silos or weapons of destruction. Now that's destruction of property. Someone in the chat also mentioned that there's the category of destruction of property that is being used to perpetuate an injustice, right? And so some theorists have said in peace studies, if the destruction of property is in order to stop an injustice, is in order to prevent further violence from happening, then that's a category of destruction of property that is compatible with our understandings of nonviolence. Right. And for people who are concerned about peacemaking, peace building, it's an important conversation to have. It's important for us to think through, is destruction of property ever compatible with nonviolence? Because for some communities and in some instances, it might be. There might be property that is so damaging and dangerous that it doesn't deserve the protections that we normally attribute to property. There might be strategic reasons, there might be pragmatic reasons why destruction of property isn't a good idea. But to say categorically that property is sacrosanct in a way, that property has to be protected and respected, people like Gandhi and King and Barbara Deming said, no, there are more nuanced ways to understand the role that property can play in perpetuating violence. And not all coercion is off the table. Not all coercion is the same as violence. And the destruction of some property, the leveraging of some economic sanctions can cause harm. But as someone in the chat has said, that coercion is meant to alleviate practices of violence in a broader context. And Carolyn asks, and this is a question I got from a student today because of the discussion of international sanctions on Russia. Are sanctions violent? And this might be a point of conversation that we should take. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see each other and imagine this question. And then circle back then for Triva's question about whether or not there are better ways than the destruction of property. But let's ask this question from Carolyn. Are sanctions violent? In some ways, they meet this criteria. They're intended to compel and provide a coercion. They do deprive people. They cause harm to some people, the targets of those sanctions. But what would people say? And I see Enton, your hand.
Yeah, I would just, as a group that's been working with Afghani refugees, the sanctions are certainly less violent than some other options, but the fact that the sanctions imposed there are actually hurting common people so that they don't have enough to eat, don't have medical care, I would say to those people, they're certainly violent. There is violence being done, even if it's hoped for a better reason or for a better cause or hope to achieve a greater good. It's a sticky thing because people are really hurting and being damaged by it.
People believing that sanctions are violent. If we think about the Montgomery bus boycott, would we say the same thing? Would the Montgomery bus boycott be seen as being violent?
I can't type in the chat fast to put my thoughts together, but I would imagine it's like positive versus negative piece. So if it's an incentive or a positive action, so the Montgomery bus, well, not the boycott maybe, but I was thinking of the Freedom Riders who are going into a bus to go down to a place, like that's a positive, optimistic thing. Whereas if it's intended to harm, even if it's, you know, to harm an economic thing, like a boycott, that's negative. I mean, it's using punishment rather than a positive thing. So I don't know whether, yeah, that has any nuance in the definition of violence or nonviolence, but it does seem to me that there's a difference between doing something positive to live into a positive change versus something that's punishing or negative in order to try to get somebody to do something differently by punishing them in some way for what they're doing now.
Isn't it this is Don. I don't like all the typing in the chat room either. Isn't it kind of, when we look at these situations, you know, don't you always have to kind of consider the downstream effects? So I think about the recent truckers blockade of the bridge to Canada. And so really, you know, innocent people not really involved in that, not involved in masking decisions or COVID decisions, they suffered because of that, because there were economic repercussions and things. So isn't it really violent whenever an action causes some kind of a painful or untoward effect on another person's life or livelihood?
Well, I cause pain to my children. They'll tell you virtually every day of their lives, right? There are ways in which I think that our household culture is pretty respectful. I think we strive for that, but there have absolutely been times, especially, and less now that they're older, but when they were younger, when as parents we were coercive. We injured their goals. We took away some of their resources. We took away things of ours that they enjoyed. Would they say that they were harmed? They would have said that. In fact, they did quite regularly, and they protested. So the question, I guess, this is a way of questioning: is coercion always violence?
So don't we get confused a little bit? So are we looking at the basic understanding? You know, I don't know. So it's, you know, when we begin to look at the, I don't know, the effects or the intentions, or, you know, when raising children. So does that cloud the issue that bottom line, black and white, it's violence? It meets the definition of violence. Are there different levels and applications? Absolutely. You know, some are truly vicious and heartless. Some aren't. But still, you know, by the letter of the law or the description, violence is violence. So even though, you know, I raised my children too, and it still seems the same, and mine are in their mid-30s. I mean, we still have a lot of the issues we had when they were 8. But you know, when you do those things, it you know, it's hurting them. You know, so I don't know. It's a really difficult question that you put out there.
I think any action that we do as human beings has the possibility of causing good, and often does, and has the possibility of causing harm, which it more often does as well. And I think that what Martin Luther King would say is we're doing this for a higher good. Yes, some people are getting harmed, but there's a higher value here that we are living toward. That's why I asked the question, what's our authority? Who are we calling on? Who or what? Or I think as Christians, we have to probably say that we are looking toward the Bible, or we're looking toward Jesus's life, or we're looking toward our God to help us make these decisions. But I find I'm often wrong anyway.
Did anyone see the number of people that were in the square in Russia complaining or standing up saying, we don't want this to happen, because they knew they were going to suffer? So there seems to be a greater good in some of this.
I did see that, Judy. I heard that about 2,000 people were arrested today across Russia in protesting the invasion in Ukraine. These questions are important. We talk about it in peace studies about understanding what violence is. Absolutely, as intersecting with the concerns that we've raised here about, anything can cause harm, right? Anything can also cause psychological damage, even if it doesn't cause material damage. Would we say something like the Montgomery bus boycott causes psychological damage? Or if we think about the student sit-ins in the 60s, the psychological damage that might do to the racists that were refusing service at the lunch counters, right? Is that doing violence? And what we end up talking about in peace studies is the danger of highlighting everything in a book, right? The purpose of a highlighter, when you take notes or when you read a book, is to pick out the things that are significant in an important way and to distinguish them from the rest. And what happens if we label violence so broadly that it doesn't separate out significantly those actions that harm in a particular way? Right? It would take away any of our capacities, in effect, of responding positively and in a way that would be called nonviolently to situations of injustice. So some lines are clear, right? Attacking someone cannot be construed as a nonviolent response, as something that's a legitimate response to violence. But other responses, like an economic boycott, and Enton's point is an important one. Who is it that will suffer as a consequence of our actions? And in what ways will they suffer? The economic sanctions that were imposed upon Iraq, say, from in the 1990s, the people who bore the brunt of that suffering were the people who were the most innocent, right? So there's this question: can economic sanctions be considered nonviolent? In peace studies, almost across the board, people say yes, it's an effective nonviolent tool in the way that boycotts are an effective nonviolent tool.
Unless if they work. I mean, if the sanctions don't work, then it's just harming innocent people. If it stops at all World War, of course, then it would be considered something that's good.
Yeah.
I was surprised that many people complained before it actually happened. That that really surprised me.
Yeah.
It occurs to me that in our national conversation now, and in our local conversations, that there might be a question about from parents, is my child being damaged by the educational system, by things that are being taught, by books that our children are reading? So it occurs to me that we even are having this conversation on a local level when we're afraid to be exposed to history or truth.
Right. It's shocking, some of the stuff. I didn't know a lot of that stuff, and it was shocking to me.
Maybe we introduce the word pain along with harm. And it isn't quite, pain isn't quite as harmful in my book as the word harm. So where's the place for causing pain or uncomfortableness? Is that violence?
And, so you hear that, you hear that term, I hear that a lot, the greater good, but it's like, are the people that are actually being harmed and struggling, do they have the same perspective? Would they stand up and say, oh, well, it's for the greater good, so we're okay with this? You know what I mean? So I think, a lot of it is just where you personally are at the moment and what is happening in your life. And I think that that's going to influence, so, we didn't really speak to it when it happened, but like in our group, when we broke out in our little breakout, it was fascinating to me. Every individual in the group had a very specific life event at the moment that led them to a certain level of macro, micro, or whatever they were, large, big, small. And everybody picked that level based on a current life event, and I think like in this discussion, when we're talking about violence and sanctions and greater good, I think it kind of depends on what part of the receiving end you're on there. Are you instituting the sanctions, or are you suffering from the sanctions? And I think you're going to get different definitions on, oh, I think that's violence, or I think, no, that's painful, but that's not so bad. So just my thoughts.
And if I may, I can't remember who said what that triggered the aha, that we were brought up with the golden rule, treat others as you want to be treated. And then someone raised my consciousness and said, consider the silver rule, treat others the way they want to be treated. And so my acts may not be intentionally harmful, causing trauma or violent, but someone else might experience them in that way, unbeknownst to me perhaps, and not by my intention. So kind of keeping myself aware of that is kind of, for me, another level and layer. Thanks.
Well, theorists such as King and Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, said that economic sanctions and boycotts are confronting are a mechanism for confronting oppressive institutions with the consequences of their choices and practices. And next week, are we ready for the teaser, Virginia? Next week,
Probably. Right.
we're going to talk about, so we've talked about violence and the things that are off the table, right? Or the conversations that we have to have, the considerations that we have to make when we think about responding to violence and injustice. Next week, we're going to talk about what Peace Studies examines or offers up as those responses, right? So if we're committed to nonviolence, what Gandhi called ahimsa, right? This understanding of not just a rejection of violence, but a call to love and a call to wholeness. What then can we do as a response when at all of these levels, at the macro level and the meso level and the micro level and the intrapersonal level, we're confronted with things that we need to change, things that we need to address. What happens then? So our emphasis next week, right, Virginia?
Yes.
Is on where we go from here. But I appreciate so much the conversation and the community of people who are devoted to this work and thinking about how we are meant to be in the world and how we can be differently in the world. Virginia and I are happy to hang out. We want to be respectful of your time. If people have to sign off now, I will look forward to seeing you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. But if you have some more questions, you're free to put them in the chat or reach me by email, or we'll be happy to hang out here and have a little bit more of a conversation and get to know you better. But otherwise, we will see you next week.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Katie and Virginia.